Welcome back. It is our honor to host here Sir Rob Wainwright, partner at the Deloitte Risk Advisory from the UK, and he will talk to us today about trust in a hyper-connected, digitalized society. Thank you, Sir Rob, and I'll be back for Q&A after your talk.
Great, thank you very much. Warm welcome to you all. Yes, I'm Rob Wainwright, and I work in the business sector now, but for most of my career, for 30 years in fact, almost 30 years, I worked in the government sector in the fields of intelligence and law enforcement. And for almost a decade, up until 2018, I was the executive director of Europol, the European Law Enforcement Agency, which coordinates operations and indeed information sharing across a very wide landscape of the international law enforcement community, over 1,000 law enforcement agencies and teams from 40 countries. And that period of managing the development of that agency gave me a certain insight into the development of crime and other security threats like terrorism. I'm here today to share with you what the implications of that might be in this hyper-connected digital society. So we can bring up my presentation, please. Thank you. Next slide. So we all know, of course, about the globalization of our world, our business life, of course, our private lives, as we become ever more dependent on technology. It's this globalization of that world, this evolution of a digital ecosystem in which we have become much more interconnected in different ways. The impact of COVID-19, if anything, has accelerated that interconnectedness. It's, of course, increased digital interactions between businesses and their consumers, their customers. This increased dependency that many in the business community have on these globalized supply chains, third-party vendors. The more of a digital life we had to experience during COVID times, the more dependency on this broader ecosystem we had. And of course, as we've all seen, as I'm witnessing even today, by delivering this presentation in virtual form, we have moved to the new digital norm of working from home. So COVID-19 has accelerated the globalization of the technology world and its impact on the way in which we do our business and run our private lives. Next slide, please. Now, what does that mean also for the way the industry has developed? These trends, of course, already underway for some years before the pandemic of 2020. In the manufacturing sector, of course, the rise of digital and smart factories in order to increase efficiency and reduce costs, the evolution, again, of the supply chain structure, which has a flip side, of course, as this slide deck shows, in the sense that the more dependent we become on the digital ecosystem, the more we are vulnerable to exploitation by cyber actors, of course. The more doors, I guess, can be opened or picked open around the back of our business community. And this interconnection, which has increased our digital footprint, is at the heart of the cybersecurity problem today. Next slide, please. A new digital risk landscape has emerged, to a certain extent accelerated this year, but it's one that we have been observing in the cybersecurity industry for some time, of course. There has been a continuous increase in threat trends in a way that I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about shortly. In the way also that COVID-19 showed a short spike, temporary spike in the number of different frauds and attempted frauds, of course, the number of scams that suddenly we saw a surge of around the world in the earliest part of 2020. These were opportunistic criminals in the main that were trying to run fake websites, offering fake solutions, fake tests, or even fake cures for COVID-19, of course. This is quite understandable and normal for how enterprising, entrepreneurial cyber criminals can be, how opportunistic they are. They jump on every day new opportunities to do that. Actually, they weren't terribly sophisticated in our experience. What we saw was this temporary hike in the number of scams that were proliferating, but it was quite temporary, and at least in Europe, within 6 weeks, had come back down to more normal levels. And indeed, the nature of these scams were not particularly sophisticated. So in the business community, at least, they were able to be quickly identified and isolated. But nonetheless, it generated a lot of news that at the time, criminals were also trying to exploit the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, what worried me at the same time was that this was much more of a red herring, that in the meantime, in the background, in a more shadowy way and in a quiet way, the evolution of much more aggressive threats, already the case before 2020, was still growing and still increasing at a pace during this year. So I don't think that the COVID-19 necessarily has had a significant impact on raising our threat. The threat was already becoming quite dangerous and increasing. But certainly from the point of our increased dependency on the digital ecosystem, what it has changed is our vulnerability levels. That has definitely been permanently shifted up, I think, as we become much more dependent on that digital way of life. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at the nature of those criminal threats and the way that I'm describing it, the threat actors themselves, of course, are moving with the age of digitalization. They too have become a lot more dependent on digital capabilities and technologies. Of course, they too have created their own ecosystem of partnership, their own supply chain, global supply chain of how they operate. Over the last decade, we've seen the emergence of pretty sophisticated international criminal syndicates that are trading in cyber tools and services, for example, stolen data and other illicit commodities on these very large darknet sites on the underground internet infrastructure. These syndicates are also sharing their capabilities and starting to work with one another rather than fighting with one another. In the past, we have now collaboration instead of competition between much of the criminal sector. We see, of course, how quick they are to exploit new technologies. All new technologies that arrive in the market are potentially vulnerable to criminal exploitation. In some cases, the criminals are rather good at doing that. Ransomware, of course, which has become such a dominant malware problem affecting so many businesses around the world, in itself evolved out of a criminal's attempt to exploit the early development of the last decade of digital currencies. Because ransomware is nothing if not just a modern form of a very old criminal trick, which is criminal extortion. Whereas in the past, the criminal would blackmail a businessman to say, if you don't give me $10,000, I'm going to do this and expose you, meet me under the bridge at midnight, hand over the cash. Didn't quite know, of course, that the police wouldn't be waiting for him when he received that handover in cash. Now, of course, in the anonymized world of digital currency, that form of criminal extortion and transaction can be done in the online world, where the perpetrator is fully anonymized and protected. And so the modern form of that kind of blackmail extortion is ransomware, and it has grown significantly in scale over those years to be perhaps the most dominant malware problem today. It's an example of how criminals are moving with the age of digitalization to exploit technologies and turn their benefits against us. At the heart of this new criminal syndicate, cyber criminal economy that we now have in the world are also the idea of professional criminal enablers, people who specialize in producing specific criminal tools and services. Professional money launderers have become a major feature of the financial crime problem around the world. Dedicated hackers who are producing the latest strands of very specific, maybe hacking tools and forms of malware, for example, in the banking sector, that larger criminal syndicates are then buying online from these professional enablers. And all of this is contributing to a growth in the size of the cyber criminal economy, and to a certain extent, also in the level of sophistication in the attacks that they propagate. Next slide, please. But when we look at the nature of those attacks, going back to one of my earliest points, COVID-19 showed just how opportunistic in the main cyber criminals are. I still think that accounts for the largest part of the cyber criminal economy that we have today. Actors in the main who are in the business of fairly low tech, low sophistication, but very high volume forms of attempted frauds online, scams online, and other forms of cybercrime. So ransomware attacks at their sort of lowest level of sophistication that are thrown out into the wild in the hope of catching a few random victims. Denial of service attacks in the same way, but especially in the way in which the largest part of the cyber criminal economy depends on the illegal acquisition and exploitation of data, personal data. As much data as possible, stolen from as many different organizations' databases as possible, so that it can be traded in industrial sizes and quantities on these darknet sites for other criminals to buy them and use them as the basis for generating fraud, a range of different frauds, mortgage frauds, tax frauds, social benefit frauds, and so on. So it's data really that is the oil in the system of the cyber criminal economy, and which is the reason why we see a continuous spread of news of cyber incidents relating to data breaches, relating to ransomware. It's what feeds the system. That said, at the top end of the cyber criminal economy, there are a breed of actors, a minority, but still representing a sizable, maybe 10% of the overall size of the economy, a breed of actors that are in a different business, in a much more dangerous one for the interests of us and the business community. These are high-end cyber criminal actors working very often closely with malicious state actors who are developing state-of-the-art malware capabilities that are not thrown out into the wild in a randomized way, but used to directly target the internal networks of some companies. And some of the forms of destructive malware, for example, some of the advanced forms of ransomware that we've seen in the last year are an indicator of just how prevalent a more aggressive strain of cybercrime has become, at least in certain respects. And it's a combination of social engineering and malware capability that makes it such a dominant part of the problem. How advanced forms of social engineering initially is a route in, perhaps through a third-party supply chain, for a criminal organization to take hold of the internal networks of a large bank or another global enterprise. And from there, of course, they can move around the system in order to generate high levels of fraud, for example. Next slide, please. What you have on the screen here is an indicator of one particular case relating to the so-called Carbonac gang that I had experience at first of helping to investigate in my former job at Europol, and it remains quite a dominant cyber criminal organization in the world. This is an organization that has stolen over $1 billion from over 30 financial institutions around the world over the last few years. And they've done it according to the playbook that I just described, using advanced forms of malware, hidden maybe as a fake invoice, sent to a junior employee in the finance department, who clicks on that invoice. It's not an invoice. Embedded in that invoice is actually an advanced form of a remote access Trojan malware capability that allows that criminal organization then to actually move around the internal part of the network until they can identify and compromise through social engineering maybe the person who is managing the accounts for some of the bank transfer payment systems, the system administrator, for example. Now, if you can do that, as they had done in many, many cases, then you can manipulate the accounts on those bank transfer payment systems and generate fraud. You can then move that fraud out and launder it through different means. It's a very significant strategic case and symptomatic of this high-end problem that we have. One of the strategic dimensions of this, which attracts my interest, is the extent to which that one criminal syndicate, and there are other examples, have actually moved across what were until recently the different criminal domains of cyber, fraud, and money laundering. Now it is much more part of a conversion connected criminal ecosystem, the same syndicate carrying out the same activities across that criminal life cycle, from crime to checking out the profits and laundering it as well. This is important because whereas the criminals have moved out of their silos in this respect, we still haven't actually, and most of the global banks are still managing the risks of cyber fraud and money laundering in different domains, certainly according to different regulatory environments, different governance arrangements, and certainly different data streams as well. And it's a strategic challenge, I think, to that sector. Next slide, please. So I'm describing a threat scene from cybercrime that to some extent, and in the largest form, remains opportunistic in nature, one that can be fairly easily identified and tracked by the right kind of cybersecurity controls in the right kind of enterprise environment. One that also, though, has a much more dangerous, aggressive end to it. Examples of threats that can undermine the cybersecurity capabilities of any organization, potentially. And with that in mind, what is emerging, I think, in the cybersecurity industry is this idea that we have long since moved beyond the point of considering what we have to do to remove the threat, to isolate ourselves from the threat. There is no magic dollar that can be spent. There is no magic technological solution that will solve cybercrime as such. It is now endemic to our business life, certainly in this world of a hyper-connected digital ecosystem in which we move. It is here to stay, I think, but it's here at the same time to be managed in the right kind of way, and managed in a similar way to other risks that are prevalent in our everyday life, and indeed in the business sector as well. It's a risk, albeit a serious and complex one, that should be managed, can be managed, and managed in a way that can allow us still to have a successful business experience, of course. So this idea of moving to a position of resilience, shifting the mindset from the board level down to one of accepting the risk, addressing it head on, and managing it within an environment and according to a level that is comfortable for that particular business. It means, for example, that on business continuity ideas, one has to accept that some forms of malware, as has been seen in some notable cases recently, are advanced enough to not only, for example, encrypt or even wipe data on the main IT platforms of an organization, but also even the backup systems. So it changes this concept of what business continuity means. This idea of resilience of business continuity means something else now. That when you know that, you have to change the golden rules of business continuity that we've been following for 30 or 40 years, which were we should back up all of our data, as much of it as we can, continuously updated. So what we have on the backup system is the latest, most pristine, most complete version of our data set. So we could bring it back online when there is an IT outage. Actually, because of the exposure of even a backup system being affected in the most dangerous malware attack, that's the last thing we should do now. So the idea has emerged instead of a smarter cyber recovery playbook, which involves our only backing up the data that we absolutely must depend on, the crown jewel data that is critical, mission critical to our business, that data that you absolutely need in the first 24, 72 hours after a cyber incident. That you should not leave it permanently online to be potentially infected by a malware attack. You shouldn't leave it permanently online to be continuously updated. You should update it very infrequently, actually, and for most of the time keep it in an offline state. So it's changed this idea of what we need to do to live within this new age of cyber being a reality. This idea of resilience, which is still a very smart way of functioning, and managing that threat and mitigating its effects in the way that I've been describing. At the same time, and on the more positive side, thinking about how, like if the criminals have leveraged technology and data themselves, how we can do it as well, how we can make the best use of technological capabilities to help us to track the threat, automatize some of our response measures, how we can use data to better understand the nature of the problem in the first place. Next slide, please. I come from a world for many years of a so-called intelligence-led culture, which is the way in which we've addressed the significant challenge from terrorism in Europe in recent years, for example, one which relies on our ability to work as a collective community, share, exchange information across a number of sources, analyze that in a smart way in order to generate an intelligent view of the threat, to maximize your knowledge of the threat, and with that, better understanding what the threat actually looks like, to use that as the basis in which to drive your control measures. Now that sounds like an obvious thing to do, and it's something at the heart of European counterterrorism strategy. It was the heart of what Europol tried to do in bringing together 1,000 different agencies. It's only when we did that and can connect so many of the dots could we really see the emergence of this new globalized criminal problem. And with that very powerful knowledge, we could drive more impactful operations. Now we need to do more of that and more of the same of that in managing the real risks in the business sector. It applies as much, by the way, to financial crime as it does to cyber crime. But in cyber, it means enhancing our ability to fuse data, certainly across different industries, but also within a single enterprise, for example, within a bank. If indeed the criminals, as I said earlier, moved out of their silos, we need to do the same. We need to make the data work for us. We have, in most banks, powerful potential data sets tracking cybercrime, fraud, and money laundering. If that can be fused into a single data set, then the analysis of that is likely to identify the unknown connections hidden in the network so far that will indeed reveal the points at which this convergence across the domains is happening. Once you identify those connections, you're in a much better, stronger, more positive, proactive position to respond to the problem, rather than waiting for that bad day to happen and being in that permanently reactive state. Next slide, please. So I'm describing how we should move, perhaps already with some signals, moving towards a new age of collaboration and trust, one that redefines the business of security as something that is much more central to business life, the extent to which we can no longer judge and view cybercrime as something that is a niche subject in one part of the business. Of course, it affects all parts of the business. One in which the rise of data sharing utilities in industry is important, that the sharing of data not just within the organization, but also between, across the sector, between different companies, and importantly, of course, between industry and law enforcement authorities as well. And in doing so, we move to a position in which data works for us in a better way. We help each other to better understand the nature of this dynamic threat, giving us that stronger position to be a more proactive actor, to help to prevent, identify, and indeed respond to the most dangerous forms of cybercrime. And in doing so, of course, if we can do that, we will generate a more responsible, proactive position to the threat of cybercrime. That will be the foundation then of winning the trust of customers, regulators, and society as well, being seen to work over time in a non-competitive way with our collaborators, with our colleagues across different industry, working also with inside our enterprises to share data in a more effective way. Next slide, please. And that means moving to this new paradigm for managing complex risk, where we acknowledge the threat, where we are led by intelligence and led by appreciation of risk. And that drives us, therefore, to understand that not all security controls, for example, are as important as others. Not all of our data sets are as mission critical as others. That we get to a smarter position of being informed by the threat and taking control measures that we think will have the optimum value on enhancing our security and at the same time helping to facilitate and enable our business in the mainstream. End up becoming resilient, more adaptable, and in developing a systemic resilience that allows us to deal much more with future shocks, so that whatever the latest dynamic strain of cyber capability might be, we have a systemic resilience that can allow us to cope with most of the worst of that might come our way. Next slide, please. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for your attention today and for sharing with you. I wish I could be there with you in person. That was always the plan. I'm here in Europe talking to you. It's been a pleasure nonetheless, and I will stay engaged with you for the next few minutes to take any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob, for this presentation. So first of all, yes, this is very concerning. I want to reassure everyone that I am cyber threat proof. I don't back up my work. And when I do, I really wish well to the hackers trying to figure out my filing system and extracting any useful information out of it. But on a more serious note, you're talking about our need to go towards a new age of collaboration and trust and a new paradigm of managing complex risks. Now, on a systematic level, and we'll deep dive into it in a second, we definitely need to do it. But what can people in the audience do on their business, if it's a small business, on an individual level, in order to minimize the effect of cyber threats on themselves? And what new tools are there for them to protect themselves?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about cyber hygiene in the cybersecurity industry, and the importance of just getting the basics right, and making sure that there is, protection on your core infrastructure, of course. Making sure that also your staff in all businesses, large or small, are sufficiently made aware, at least to a certain standard of the nature of the cyber threats. Carrying out basic hygiene controls over don't click on a suspicious link, for example. So, there are the top 10 things that any company should be doing, could be doing rather inexpensively on making sure that certain cybersecurity protocols are in place. Now, those basics are quite achievable actually for any business, and yet even the basics very often are not covered, even by some of our larger companies. So I would say focus on getting your digital hygiene in shape. There's enough good advice from government sectors available as to what those top 10 things should be, for example. Focus on getting that right, and if you do that, you will take care of the largest part of the problem. You will likely be much safer from this higher end opportunistic nature of cybercrime. I think where that, however, is not quite enough in the worst case scenarios of these much less common but much more impactful events, then there's only so much that you can do to withstand an attack like that. And so that means, in addition to what I've just said, you need to train for the day when you have a major incident, to make sure that you can respond and make the right decision under time pressure at the time. So some kind of cyber simulation event, certainly some cyber incident plan that should be worked up by the businesses to cope with that.
I have a question from the audience. What do you think about the concept of anonymity? Should we compromise our liberty for more security? And I imagine they're relating to blockchain or encrypted related means.
No, as a former law enforcement, law enforcement chief, you might be surprised to hear that I don't believe in that. I don't necessarily think that law enforcement authorities should be given more powers in that sense. And I certainly don't think that we should compromise on the benefits, of course, of a digitalized society that give us. Those benefits are considerable, as much in our private lives as in our business life. And the notion of data privacy, of course, is a very, very important one in Western democracies. So we need to hang on to those benefits and cherish them and do our best to protect them, notwithstanding how difficult it has become for the law enforcement agencies in this age of encryption to still do their work. So no, let's not undermine the very benefits that we're here to protect in the first place. Let's enjoy them and work as much as we can to mitigate the effects of others who are trying to destroy them.
Another related question from the audience, specifically asking about a black box information validation system. Do you believe that this type of system is a potential solution for cyber risks or on individual level moving forward?
Yes, I'm not sure what the questioner means by that black box environment. So it's not something that I don't understand that phrase. Of course, I understand what black box means, but I'm not in the context of that specific question. I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. Then I have a question for you. We're talking about the increased and more organized cyber risks and threats that are coming, that are creating a mistrust, reasonable mistrust about technology. But I believe that there are other factors that are marrying these incidents in order to create mistrust. Can you talk a little bit more about the more societal mistrust? And in my perspective, it's the pop culture of man versus machine, misunderstanding technology, and actual failures in user experience and user interaction. How do you see them related to increasing cyber threats and increasing the mistrust that we have?
Well, another version of that, of course, is the concern we all have about levels of disinformation online, and we recognize that a large part of our digital experience is maybe not reliable in many respects, and one in which we are getting news feeds from multiple sources, not all of which perhaps have the strongest editorial controls at their source. So I think yes, the digital experience has reshaped our understanding of what it is to engage with one another, and there's a potential that we become more cynical as a result. I do think at the same time, though, that as more and more people understand that is a factor of the life, if we all engage on certain social media platforms, we can see a whole range of views, of course, a whole range of truisms and the opposite. We can all identify that, and it becomes evident to us, therefore, after a while, that is a factor of our digital experience. Actually, in a way, it hardens us perhaps to become more sensitive and sensitized to potential acts of cybercrime. So if anything, I think what you're describing helps us to better understand and accommodate the problem of cybercrime, because it might challenge us more often to just be that bit more skeptical about, is this email suspicious or not? So there might even be a healthy connotation from what you're saying, I think.
I completely agree. And I have now a question. I'll just put it in one word: cryptocurrency. And I would like to. I have a very split opinion about the value and the risks of cryptocurrency, and it has been kind of like a trending topic, and then going away, and then actually with COVID-19, people are tending to use less cash and move more to digital transaction and cryptocurrency. Where do you see this sitting within cybersecurity issues and solutions, perhaps?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that the sort of core of blockchain technology, especially, which I know is more than just cryptocurrency, has tremendous security value and potential. And we're just at the start, I think, of what that means for how we can imagine a more secure way of doing really sensitive business in the future. At the same time, cryptocurrencies themselves have been exploited by criminals in the same way as other technologies. It's nothing as special for cryptocurrencies, but in this case, I gave you the example earlier of how it is directly relevant to the rise of ransomware. We've also seen how cryptocurrencies have been the vehicle for some amounts of money laundering. Still not the largest part of the financial crime problem, but still a significant trend. And also large Ponzi-like fraud schemes. So, as with other technologies, there is, a side of this that is open to criminal exploitation. That's apart from, the question, I think, also, which is about, the future of cryptocurrencies as a form of transfers, payment transfers, of course, and that's something which now central banks in many countries are also considering how to manage. So, as with all new technologies, I think some great benefits, but also some work to do to ensure that we don't allow the criminals a free pass at making it even harder for us.
Thank you. And how should we deal? I mean, the idea of cyber crime syndicates is, for me, a mind-blowing, in a bad way, a mind-blowing concept. What are governments and organizations doing right now in order to deal with such threat, and what should they be doing on a short and long term in order to really put that under control?
Yes, the problem is a very challenging one. Firstly, encryption, for example, and we discussed this earlier, the ability of encryption, and again, for criminals to exploit that ability, has moved those criminal actors much more into the darker world, where it's much more difficult for investigators to identify. So in any criminal investigation, always the first step is to identify the suspect. Actually, it's become very hard in most significant cases of these criminal syndicates online, even to take that first step in the investigation. And even after that, to have jurisdictional access to your suspect or offender, when he or she might be in a part of the world to which your authorities do not have easy access. Well, that's stage 2 of any criminal investigation. So just the fundaments of criminal investigation now have become so much more difficult in the online environment. I think it speaks for a need for our law enforcement agencies to become more novel in their approaches, and they're beginning to learn that. We're seeing more and more spectacular successes. It definitely speaks for better collaboration across the international environment. And that is challenging because, as you know, there are different countries and different regions in the world that have different mindsets around what governance of the cyberspace looks like. So this is tough, actually. That said, as I said, there have been some very, very notable successes involving Canadian law enforcement agencies and many others around North America and Europe. So there's still hope.
Reiterating a question from the audience, and again, I'll start with one word: China. Our information is kept by the Occident. Should we take, or should we fear China's hack model?
I think a core feature of the cyber threat that we face today, and a core feature of many incidents that have emerged, particularly in the last 3 years, is this increased footprint by malicious state actors from a number of countries. And it's indicative, I think, of the way in which, of course, cyber itself has become a geopolitical instrument and a modern form of, to a certain extent, a modern military weapon as well. But what has been notable, I think, in the last few years is that that has been the case for 10 years, but in the past, where offensive high-grade cyber capabilities were projected by hostile actors along a fairly narrow attack vector, aiming at military establishments or government establishments. What we've seen in the last 3 years is the widening of that attack vector, either by accident or design. And we've seen the impact of malicious state activity, cyber activity, now also reaching into many different parts of the business sector and the global economy. And that worries me, because it shows that this highest grade, very offensive cyber capability is starting to have wider damage. And again, it's become part of the systemic nature of what cybercrime is these days. So let's not single out any one country. There are a number actually of concern, but it has become a fact of life, yeah, and is at that top end of the cyber criminal problem that we face.
And not that I have magic capabilities, but if I would have, I think I would grant you, and this is a two-part question, I would grant you the possibility to rebuild the whole digital system, the internet. How would you rebuild it?
Well, you look as if you do have magical powers. You're sitting in this fantastically powerful seat there. I think you look great. I think, what would I do? I think it's interesting. I've actually had that conversation. I've been lucky enough to meet with some of the very original founders of internet technology, people like Vint Cerf way back, who you know, these were the guys, and there are only a few of them in the US, that designed the very early architecture of what today's internet looks like. You know, and they're the first to admit now that when they did that, security was far, far from their minds. Didn't even enter their minds. They were in the business of designing something that was user-friendly, user-convenient, of course, in those days, to share research material across different academic establishments, which was the very earliest form of how the internet grew. And looking back, they say, we had no particular reason to think about cyber crime in those days, so you can forgive us, actually. And that's fine, because hindsight is a wonderful thing. But he said, if we could go back in time, you know, we would have architected maybe the internet in a slightly different way. And to me, that's an interesting point. And it makes the point that the internet was never designed with security as the most important dimension, far from it. And frankly, we've been playing catch up ever since. And it's too late, actually, to go back. Unfortunately, there isn't a magical solution, even from your powerful chair.
Okay. But, and this is the second part, because I kind of suspected you will answer that. But if you could choose a magic solution right now, if we can reboot the whole internet right now, what is the one thing, and I know there is no one thing, but the one thing you will try to insert in it? What is the thing we're missing the most?
I just think I'd love to have international norms of cyber governance and cybersecurity standards agreed by every country in the world, a kind of a United Nations Charter of cybersecurity. I'd love to have, and that is also requires some magical intervention, because that's not going to happen. But if there's one thing I could do, I'd start at the very top with our governments of this world agreeing some basic norms out of which we can run a number of then effective common instruments to protect ourselves.
And who in your mind is, I don't want to say doing it right, because I don't know if anyone is doing it right, but who is making the best effort? And I'm talking about governments or regions. Who in your mind is at least at the forefront of cybersecurity measures and implementation?
Well, on that point about global governance, there is something called the Budapest Convention from the Council of Europe from about a dozen years ago. That is quite a small step in that direction, but at least a step. That's only been signed up by about 60 countries in the world. My figures might be out of date, but it's certainly much less than half of all countries in the world. I'm biased. Unlike you, I'm from a Western democracy, so that's a convention driven by those in Europe and North America, the countries that we're mostly familiar with. And from that, if you look at some of the cybersecurity protocols and standards and the way in which national cybersecurity priorities are functioning in places like the UK and the Netherlands and France and Canada and the US, then yes, I would have to say that. But then I'm biased, and I recognize that there is a different version of what the internet looks like, further east you go on the global map. I subscribe to our view, frankly, and I wish there was more of it, but then I'm bound to say that.
Well, our time is unfortunately up. I want to thank you so much for such an insightful and timely and important conversation. And I wish to meet you in real life after this whole digital disruption is over. And thanks again for your insight. This has been fantastic.
Pleasure to be with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.